In 1836, a fur trapper named Osborne Russell was camped along the Yellowstone River with Jim Bridger's brigade of 60 men. November had frozen every stream solid. Snow was piling up in the mountain passes, and the temperature was dropping toward a kind of cold that most people today have never experienced. Russell and his companions were not going anywhere until spring. What nobody knew at the time was that the shelters these men were about to build into the frozen ground would keep them alive through 5 months of winter, using a principle that modern engineers would not fully explain for another 150 years. This is the story of how mountain men survived the deadliest winters on the continent without insulation, without central heating, and in some cases, without even a stove. They did it by going underground. Nobody was paying attention to the fur trappers of the Rocky Mountains back in the 1820s and 1830s. Not the newspapers in Boston or Philadelphia, not the politicians in Washington. To most Americans living east of the Mississippi, the men heading into the mountains to trap beaver were barely a footnote. That was about to change. Between 1822 and 1840, somewhere around 3,000 men scattered across the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and the northern Great Plains in search of beaver pelts. These were the mountain men. They worked for outfits like the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, founded by William Henry Ashley and Andrew Henry in 1822, and later for John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company. The pelts they collected fed a fashion craze in Europe and the eastern United States. Beaver felt hats were the status symbol of the era, and the men who supplied the raw material lived in conditions that would have broken most people within a week. The work itself was punishing. To get prime beaver pelts, trappers had to wade knee-deep or waist-deep into freezing mountain streams in late fall and again after spring breakup to set their traps. They carried rifles weighing 12 to 14 pounds, along with traps, skinning knives, and whatever dried meat they could manage. And every year, when the streams froze hard enough that trapping became impossible, these men faced a decision that determined whether they lived or died. They had to find a place to spend the winter. The Rocky Mountains in January are not a place that tolerates mistakes. Temperatures in the high country regularly drop to -20, -30, sometimes -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind howled through the passes at speeds that turned any exposed skin into a frostbite risk within minutes, and snowfall measured in feet, not inches. The sun set early and rose late, and the night stretched for 14-15 hours at a time. A man who was not sheltered by dark was a man who might not see morning. The danger was not just cold. It was the combination of cold and wind and moisture and the sheer length of the season. Winter in the Rockies could start in October and hold until May. That is 7 months. 7 months of eating whatever you could hunt or had dried. 7 months of keeping your powder dry, keeping your animals alive, and keeping yourself from freezing to death in your sleep. A canvas tent in those conditions was close to useless. Lean-tos made of branches and stretched animal hides offered some wind protection, but they bled heat so fast that a man inside one was burning firewood all night just to keep from freezing. Canvas flapped and snapped in the gusts. Wind found every gap, every seam, every fold, and the ground beneath was a slab of frozen earth that sucked warmth out of a body faster than a fire could replace it. The mountain men who survived their first winter learned this the hard way. Osborne Russell wrote in his journal about nights where his party laid out a fresh buffalo hide on mud, spread their blankets on it, and slept while water ran onto the hide and pooled around their bodies. They woke half submerged in freezing water. That kind of experience teaches you something. And what the surviving trappers learned, mostly from the native peoples who had been living in these mountains for thousands of years, was that the answer to winter was not building up. It was digging down. The concept behind a dugout shelter sounds almost too simple. Dig a hole, cover it, move in. But the engineering that actually made it work was anything but simple, and the people who perfected it were not the mountain men at all. They were the Mandan, the Hidatsa, the Secwepemc, the Nlaka'pamux, and dozens of other indigenous nations who had been building semi-subterranean homes across North America for thousands of years. The Hidatsa earth lodges along the Missouri River in present-day North Dakota were enormous. Communities came together to build them, typically finishing in about 10 days. The structures used thick cottonwood posts arranged in a circle, topped with willow branches, prairie grass, and dense layers of packed sod. Some reached 60 feet in diameter and 15 feet high. Dense earthen walls provided insulation year-round. A central hearth beneath a smoke hole at the top kept the interior warm. And a long, tunnel-like entrance passage, usually 6 to 15 feet in length, faced south or east to greet the morning sun while blocking prevailing winter winds. These were not crude shelters. They were engineered dwellings. Farther west, the Plateau peoples of British Columbia built pit houses called kekulis. Workers excavated a hole 8 to 10 meters in diameter and about 1.5 meters deep into the earth. Over this pit, they erected a conical frame of poles, layered it with branches and bark, and covered everything with packed earth. The only entrance was through a hole at the top, reached by a ladder. A central hearth sat near the base of the ladder, and a stone slab protected the ladder from the fire's heat. When a layer of winter snow covered the roof, the insulating effect was so strong that only a small fire was needed to heat the entire interior. In a region where temperatures have historically dropped as low as -42 degrees Celsius, that is remarkable. And this is exactly the tradition that mountain men tapped into when they needed to survive. Many mountain men married into Native American families or were adopted by tribes. They spent winters in indigenous villages and learned firsthand how these shelters worked. Others observed the construction and adapted the techniques for their own smaller, rougher versions. The result was the trapper's dugout, a stripped-down version of the earth lodge built by 1 or 2 men with an axe, a shovel, and whatever materials the landscape offered. Here is how they built one. First, they chose a site. Rufus Sage, a journalist and adventurer who traveled the Rocky Mountains from 1841 to 1843, described the ideal winter camp location in detail. The spot needed to be sheltered by hills or rocks for 2 reasons. 1, to catch the full warmth of the sun during the short winter days. 2, to hide from any hostile parties who might be traveling nearby. Close to camp, there had to be a grove of trees for firewood, a water source that had not frozen completely, and enough flat ground to work with. Once the site was chosen, the trapper started digging. The pit for a 1-man or 2-man dugout typically went 3 to 5 feet into the earth, sometimes deeper if the soil allowed it. The footprint was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet for a larger shelter, because every extra square foot of space meant more heat to fill. Bigger was not better. A tight space held warmth. A spacious one wasted it. The walls of the pit were the earth itself, shaved smooth with a shovel or hatchet. Some trappers lined the walls with bark or animal hides to keep loose soil from crumbling onto their bedding. But the earth wall was the main insulator, and it stayed in place. Next came the frame. The trapper cut poles, usually from lodgepole pine or whatever timber was nearby, and laid them across the top of the pit. Heavier logs served as ridge beams, with smaller poles laid perpendicular to create a lattice strong enough to hold a substantial load. Over the frame went a layer of branches, bark, and brush, woven tight enough to hold the next layer. Cottonwood bark, stripped in long sheets, worked well. So did layers of pine boughs with the needles still on, laid shingle style so water ran off rather than seeping through. And that next layer was the key. Packed earth, sod, and sometimes chunks of frozen turf went on top of the branch layer, creating a roof that was often a foot thick or more. A good builder did not stop at one layer. He packed earth, laid more branches, packed more earth on top. The thicker the roof, the better it held heat. A dugout with 1/2 meter of soil overhead could hold an internal temperature 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the air outside, even with no fire burning at all. The entrance was critical. Instead of a door in the wall, most dugouts used a short tunnel dug into the hillside or the edge of the pit, oriented away from the direction the wind usually blew. This tunnel served a purpose that the trappers understood instinctively, even if they could not have explained the physics. Cold air is heavier than warm air. A low-entrance tunnel acts as what engineers today call a cold air trap. Warm air generated inside the shelter rises and stays at sleeping level. Cold air that enters through the tunnel sinks to the floor of the passage and stays there, unable to climb up into the main chamber. The result was a shelter that could maintain livable temperatures even in extreme cold, often without any fire at all. And this is where the science gets genuinely interesting. Just a few feet below the surface of the Earth, the temperature stays remarkably constant year-round. In most regions, the ground temperature at about 10 feet down holds steady at roughly 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This is true in Minnesota in January. It is true in Montana in February. It does not matter if the air above the surface is -30 or 95. The Earth absorbs and stores thermal energy from the sun. Roughly 47% of the solar energy that hits the surface gets absorbed into the ground. And at depth, seasonal temperature swings simply cannot reach it. The thermal mass is too great. The soil changes temperature so slowly that conditions 10 feet down in January still reflect the warmth of the previous summer. Think about what that means for a man in a hole in the ground. The air above him might be -30, but the Earth surrounding him on 5 sides is somewhere around 50 degrees. He is not heating his shelter. The Earth is. Modern geothermal heating systems exploit exactly this principle. They circulate fluid through loops buried underground, drawing warmth from the Earth's constant temperature to heat homes. The technology is considered cutting-edge sustainable engineering. The mountain men were doing a cruder version of the same thing 200 years ago with shovels and animal hides. A dugout 3 to 5 feet deep put its occupants within the zone where the Earth's thermal mass starts to buffer temperature extremes. The packed earth roof added another layer of insulation, trapping the warmth that the ground and the occupants' own bodies generated, and that body heat mattered more than most people realize. A single human body at rest produces roughly the same heat as a 75 to 100 watt light bulb. Put 2 or 3 trappers in a sealed dugout with good insulation, and the interior temperature could climb to 40, 50, even 60 degrees above the outside air, all without lighting a single fire. When they did build a fire, it was small. A contained fire pit lined with stones radiated warmth without scorching the wooden frame. Smoke escaped through a small vent or chimney made of stacked rocks. The fire did not need to be large because the dugout was not fighting the wind. It was not losing heat through thin canvas walls. The Earth was holding the warmth in. George Ruxton, a British adventurer who lived among the mountain men in the 1840s, described their winter camps in vivid detail. "The hunter," he wrote, "invariably erects his shelter with a wall of precipitous rock behind it to defend against gusts sweeping down the mountain gorges, facing the rising sun, near a watercourse, with his animals hobbled and feeding within sight, because nothing does a hunter dread more than a visit from horse-stealing raiders." The camps Ruxton described were not desperate survival situations. They were semi-permanent winter communities. Meat hung on poles out of reach of wolves, rifles hung under the shelter covering, protected from moisture. And around the fire at night, the men cleaned their rifles, made moccasins, ran bullets, and spun long stories about their hunting expeditions. This was the Rocky Mountain College, as the trappers called it. During the winter months, the literate trappers read aloud to those who could not read. Debates and arguments filled the long, dark evenings. One trapper described these winter camps as periods of relative leisure after a season of dangerous, back-breaking work. If you're learning something from this video, consider subscribing. I cover forgotten history and lost survival techniques every week. While the trappers were settling into their dugouts, something else was happening across the mountains that would eventually make their entire way of life obsolete. But for the moment, in the winter of 1836 or 1842, none of that mattered. What mattered was staying warm. The genius of the dugout was not any single feature. It was how everything worked together. The recessed floor put occupants below the frost line. The packed earth roof trapped heat from both above and below. The entrance tunnel blocked wind and created a thermal barrier. Body heat, which would dissipate in seconds in an open lean-to, accumulated and stayed. And when snow fell on the roof, it added yet another layer of insulation, the same principle that makes an igloo work. Snow traps air between its crystals, and loosely packed snow has an insulating value comparable to fiberglass. Compare this to what happened above ground. A canvas tent in a 30-mile-per-hour wind at -20 degrees is a death trap. Wind chill turns the effective temperature into something far worse. The canvas itself conducts cold. Convection strips heat from the tent walls as fast as a fire can produce it. And the ground beneath the tent, frozen solid, conducts heat away from any body lying on it. A trapper in a surface tent was fighting physics on every front and losing. Even a well-built log cabin with cracks between the timbers lost heat constantly. The mountain men were not building cabins, though. They did not have the time, the tools, or the intention to stay in one place for years. They needed something a man could build in 2 or 3 days with an axe and a shovel, something that would keep him alive until the streams thawed and he could get back to trapping. A trapper in a dugout had physics on his side, and that made all the difference. The Charles Nibley family offers a civilian example of how effective these shelters were. When the Nibley family settled in Wellsville, Utah in 1860, 11-year-old Charles recorded the exact dimensions and appearance of the dugout his family built. 8 family members lived in that single dugout from 1860 to 1862. Because it was partially dug into the ground, the temperature inside stayed between 60 and 70 degrees, warm enough for comfort, cool enough in summer to feel like relief. That range, 60 to 70 degrees, in a shelter built with no manufactured materials, no insulation from a hardware store, and no heating system beyond body warmth and an occasional small fire. The Nibley dugout was not unusual. It was typical. Not every mountain man built a full dugout, of course. Some winters, the trappers relied on simpler arrangements. Rufus Sage described shelters called shanties, formed from animal skins stretched carefully over an arched framework of slender poles, bent into a semicircle and stuck into the ground at both ends. These faced a large fire, with the open side catching the radiant heat and the curved back blocking the worst of the wind. They were faster to build and easier to move. A man could throw one up in a few hours and take it down just as fast. George Ruxton noted that many trappers did not even bother with the shanty unless it was snowing. At other times, they were content with a breakwind, just a low wall of brush or rock on the windward side and an open sky above. A buffalo robe beneath them, a blanket on top, and a fire nearby was enough on milder nights. But the shanty was a compromise. It worked in milder conditions, or when a group had enough firewood to keep a blaze going through the long, dark hours. For the coldest, most exposed locations, for the deep winter camps where a man might stay for 3 or 4 months at a stretch, the dugout was the shelter that kept you alive. And the men who built them understood that even if they had never heard the word geothermal and could not have explained it if they had, they understood it because they had watched. They had spent winters with the Mandan along the Missouri River, sitting inside earth lodges that were warm enough to sleep in bare skin while a blizzard raged outside. They had seen the Sequapemc descend into their kekulus through the smoke hole and come back up in the morning after sleeping comfortably through a night that would have killed an unprepared man on the surface. They had watched Plateau women bank extra earth around the base of a pit house before the first heavy snow, sealing gaps they had noticed during fall rains. They borrowed these ideas not out of academic curiosity but out of raw necessity. Copy the people who survive or die with the people who do not. This was the real education of the mountain man, not the shooting or the trapping, although those mattered enormously. The survival knowledge, the building techniques, the understanding of how wind moves across a ridgeline and how heat behaves inside an enclosed space, that came from living alongside people who had been solving these problems for generations. The mountain men who lasted longest in the Rockies were almost always the ones who built the deepest relationships with native communities. They learned the languages, they learned the customs, and they learned how to build a shelter that the land itself would heat for them. Jim Bridger, born in 1804 in Richmond, Virginia, was orphaned by 13 and apprenticed to a blacksmith. He had no formal education. He could not read or write. By 1822, at the age of 18, he had joined William Ashley's fur trapping expedition and headed into the Rocky Mountains. He would spend the next 20 years in the wilderness, becoming one of the most famous mountain men in American history. Bridger spoke multiple Native American languages, married into 3 different tribes over his lifetime, and his knowledge of the western landscape was so thorough that he could sketch accurate maps of terrain he had passed through only once, decades after the fact. He was among the first Americans to see the Great Salt Lake and the geysers of Yellowstone, although his stories about boiling springs and petrified forests were so outlandish that people back east assumed he was lying. He was not lying. He just lived in a world that most Americans could not imagine. Bridger survived in part because he adapted. He learned from every group he encountered, native and European alike, and he applied what worked. When winter came, he did not try to out-tough it. He dug in. Jedediah Smith took a different approach. He traveled more, rested less, and pushed into territory that even experienced mountain men avoided. He was mauled by a grizzly bear in 1823, an attack that nearly tore his scalp off and left his left ear hanging by a strip of skin. A fellow trapper named James Kleiman sewed it back on with a needle and thread in the field. Smith survived, kept exploring, and was eventually killed by Comanche warriors along the Cimarron River on the Santa Fe Trail in 1831. He was 32 years old. Smith was brilliant, fearless, and relentless. He was also the kind of man who would rather push through a mountain pass in December than dig in and wait. And that difference in temperament mattered. The mountain men who lasted longest were not always the toughest or the bravest. They were the ones who knew when to stop moving. Kit Carson, who became possibly the most famous mountain man of all, understood this. He spent winters camped in valleys where game was plentiful and shelter could be dug quickly. He married into the Arapaho Nation and later the Cheyenne, learning winter survival techniques from both peoples. Carson lived to be 58, a remarkably long life for a man in his profession. Not every mountain man found the right spot to dig in for winter. But those who did, those who chose the sheltered valley with the south-facing slope, the grove of dry timber, the creek that still ran beneath the ice, those men came out in spring healthy, rested, and ready for another season. They had not conquered the winter, they had gone beneath it. The fur trade collapsed in the 1840s. Fashion shifted from beaver felt to silk. The beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in many drainages. The annual Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, where trappers gathered each summer to sell furs and resupply, held its last meeting in 1840. The era was over, but the knowledge did not disappear entirely. Settlers heading west along the Oregon and California trails built dugouts as their first shelters in new territory. On the Texas plains and prairies, dugouts were the basic form of shelter during early settlement, particularly prominent on ranches and farms where families lived in them until something more permanent could be built. Homesteaders on the Great Plains, where timber was so scarce that a man could ride for days without seeing a tree tall enough to cut, dug into the earth out of the same necessity that had driven the mountain men. In the Dakotas, in Kansas, in Nebraska, families carved homes out of the ground and lived in them for years, not months. And the principle that the earth itself is a heating system if you know how to use it quietly persisted in folk building traditions for another century before modern engineers rediscovered it and gave it a technical name. Today, a residential geothermal heat pump installation costs tens of thousands of dollars and involves drilling hundreds of feet into the earth, circulating fluid through specialized piping, and connecting to a compressor system that concentrates the Earth's constant 55-degree warmth into something that can heat a 2,000-square-foot house through a Canadian winter. It is considered one of the most efficient heating technologies on the planet. 200 years ago, a man with a shovel, an axe, and enough daylight could accomplish a rougher version of the same thing in 2 or 3 days. He did not need a compressor. He did not need piping. He just needed to put himself inside the earth instead of on top of it. The scale was different. The underlying physics was identical. The mountain men did not have the vocabulary to explain why their dugouts worked. They did not know about thermal mass, R values, or convective heat loss. They knew something simpler and more important. They knew that when you dig down, the cold stops following you. They knew that a hole in the ground with a roof of packed earth and a low entrance stays warm when everything above it is trying to kill you. And they knew it because the people who lived in these mountains before them, the people who built the earth lodges and the kekulus and the pit houses, had known it for thousands of years. The real question is not how they figured it out. It is why we forgot. If you want to see how another group of people survived impossible conditions with nothing but what the land gave them, That video is on screen now.